Thank you, Chairman. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Great pleasure to be here. To start, though, by bringing you apologies from Joanne Seegers, who, of course, was looking forward to this. Joanne's a bit under the weather. She is in the office today, but her voice seems to have been misplaced somewhere else, so she wasn't really up to giving this presentation today, I'm afraid. Chris did say to me just before we started, I thought slightly cheekily, but it must be very quiet in the NPF office today. And I suppose as a former chairman, he can make that sort of comment, but as a humble member of staff, I couldn't possibly comment. Although I never disagree with Chris unless it's the financial transaction tax, but we might come back to that. I have to tell you, Chairman, you nearly didn't have any speaker at all for this session because Joanne and I were in Brussels for a day of meetings yesterday, so I hope that I've got some up-to-the-minute information for you. But while we were there, unfortunately, someone jumped in front of a Eurostar train near Ashford yesterday morning, which was terrible, of course, but meant there were then no Eurostars at all in any direction for the rest of the day. So there was chaos, of course, when we got back to Gare du Midi in the early evening. And for a while, it looked like we were going to be staying in Brussels overnight, but Joanne's PA, Jenny, did a great job and got us on the last plane to Heathrow. So here I am. So my first piece of advice for you is if you also find yourselves going to Brussels for a day and you think the Eurostar will waft you there and back with no trouble at all, always take your toothbrush because you never know. So that's certainly a lesson I have learnt. But I'm really here today, as it says on the screen, to give you an update on the latest on the review of the EU directive on workplace pensions and some other EU developments, and in particular what it means for you in your roles as trustees, scheme managers, as people involved every day in workplace pensions. Can you all hear me, by the way? Because this microphone sounds a little bit like it's a bit in and out. Is it okay at the back? Excellent. Right. Well, I always like to start these talks with a bit of the political background, because all this sort of stuff about workplace pensions and regulation of pensions is all a bit techie, but ultimately it's always about the politics. Everything in Brussels is political. And the most recent important development, of course, we've had was that last November we had a new team of European commissioners took office. There they are in the middle, all 28 of them, one for each member state, led by the chap at the top right there, Jean-Claude Juncker, the new president of the European Commission, former Prime Minister of Luxembourg. You may remember he's the man David Cameron tried to block, unsuccessfully, of course, but there he is with his team of commissioners. And it's been pretty interesting, at least for sort of Euro watchers like me, seeing what they've been, what sort of start they've made, the new team of European commissioners. Because you'll recall the previous commission under President Barroso, and with the Frenchman Michel Barnier in the crucial internal market role, were very focused on preventing a repeat of a crisis. So we've seen over the last few years a whole swathe of new investment markets and financial regulation brought in to introduce new capital buffers, new safeguards for all sorts of financial sectors to stop the 2008 crash ever happening again. That was a theory anyway. The new agenda under Juncker, at least in the initial few months, has been completely different. And the mantra you'll hear now at the start of every European Commission statement or speech is that they're seeing policies through the prism of jobs and growth. It's all about getting the EU economy going again. So the challenge of the last few years was about stopping another crisis. Now it's all about how the heck do we get some growth into the European economy. So that is different, and it's, I think, a more positive foundation on which policy can be built. The other sort of positive thing is we've now, of course, rather to our pleasant surprise, got a Brit in charge of EU financial services policy. So if I'm allowed to leap off the lectern, because I like to do this sort of thing. So here he is, Jonathan Hill, the new European Commissioner, Lord Hill, to give him his formal name, new European Commissioner for financial stability, financial services, and capital markets union. They like to give them snappy titles in Brussels. But he's in charge of insurance policy, pensions policy, etc. I have to say, he is sort of living proof with his former distinguished career working in Number 10 for John Major, being an education minister, serving as leader of the House of Lords in the cabinet of Her Majesty's government for a whole year. But you can be a cabinet minister in the UK and still no one has ever heard of you. But I've heard of him, and I used to rub up against him a little bit when I was a very junior person 20 years ago working in the British political system, and he's an extremely able man, and speaking in his first UK speech as European Commissioner at the NAPF's investment conference next week. And Joanne, I know, would definitely have told you that and told you all that you must register, and it's still not too late. So we've got Lord Hill there, and that's really good news. And it's not all, of course, he won't have it all plain sailing as a Brit, because he's got to balance all the interests. And the worst mistake he could make would be to be seen to be just sort of serving the interests of the City of London and the bankers in London. He's got to ensure he's seen as working in the interests of Europe as a whole. So he's got to inject some balance there. He's also working in quite a complex structure. There's Mr. Juncker up there who's introduced this new structure where he's got vice presidents, a whole series of vice presidents. And this is one, this man at the top left, Jyrki Katainen, the former Prime Minister of Finland. And Lord Hill reports to Mr. Katainen, so we can't just have it all his own way. And there's also this tremendously important man, another one you've probably never heard of, but I'm sure you will, Frans Timmermans, former Dutch minister, and he's now the first vice president, a new job title, first vice president of the European Commission. And he's talking a good game. He's talking a lot about only legislating when absolutely necessary, much improved impact assessment. All sounds good. Now, we'll see how it pans out, but he's certainly making the right sort of noises. So we've got this new team of European commissioners. If you notice this, Jim, you get a little sort of buzz when you go forward. Slightly odd, that. Anyway, I really want to give you an update on what's happening on the EU Pensions Directive. Can I do a sort of show of hands? Because I never quite know if everyone else follows EU politics in the same sort of slightly anarchy way I do. Who here is aware of the IORP directive, the Directive on Institutions for Occupational Retirement Provision? Very impressive. A good class of students, Chairman. Excellent. Much better, I think, than the last audience I spoke to, although I have spotted one or two people who've heard this one before. But so since 2003, we've had a directive on workplace pensions, the Directive on Institutions for Occupational Retirement Provision. So an IORP, or IORP, is the EU jargon for workplace pension scheme. The current directive is very sort of high level, quite simple. Its requirements easily satisfied by the systems and regulations we've got in place in the UK. But the Commission has decided that the directive's been around for a few years now. Circumstances have changed. We've got the rise of DC, for example, and it needs updating and reviewing. The good news is that the thing we absolutely have spent years battling to keep out of the new directive, i.e. solvency-style funding rules for pension schemes, which would have made DB schemes far more expensive to fund, have been left out of all this. And that was as a result of a furious amount of lobbying by the British government, working closely with the Dutch and the Irish and the Germans and Belgians, and also ourselves, teamed up with the CBI and the TUC and their European equivalents, all putting together quite a powerful alliance of opposition, which meant that Michel Barnier, who you see in those two pictures, who was Jonathan Hill's predecessor and in charge of all this, realised he just wouldn't be able to get that proposal through if he brought it forward. So all the solvency stuff left aside. So what we've got left in this quite large new directive is two main headings. It covers governance of pension schemes and communications you've got to send to your members. So just to review what some of the proposals are, and this was all published last year. I'm sorry, there is a mistake on this. It was in March 2014, not May. I'm sure you all spotted that. So there's a proposal that there should be a risk evaluation for pensions. That's a new risk report that schemes would have to compile. You'd have to have a remuneration policy as a pension scheme, and publish it, make it available. There are new requirements on outsourcing and on internal audit. On outsourcing, for example, you'd be required to notify the regulator, the pensions regulator, of all the activities you outsource and to whom. There are quite important new requirements on those running the schemes, effectively on trustees. A requirement that they be both fit and proper. This really matters, and I'm going to come back to that later. There was some quite welcome easing of some of the existing directives restrictions on investments. I think that's quite good news. There's a requirement specifically for DC schemes that they would have to appoint a depository. Now, we've been trying to work out what this really means. It's a bit of a continental concept, I suppose. It essentially means an institution that would have oversight responsibilities, rather like a board of trustees does, and also safekeeping responsibilities, rather like we would expect from a custodian. There's been an issue over, a battle over the rules on cross-border schemes. One of the oddities of the current IORP directive is that if you're a cross-border scheme with members in more than one EU member state, the rules say you have to be fully funded at all times. You cannot run a deficit ever. And that, of course, is one of the reasons why, surprise, surprise, there are very few cross-border schemes, because it's a very high hurdle to get over. And we had hoped that the Commission were going to relax this rule in the new directive, and indeed that's what we've been told. But at the last minute they decided not to, and now this is an issue that's going to be debated. And then on the communications side, there's a proposal in the draft new directive that every scheme would have to send a pension benefit statement to all its members at least once a year. And I mean, this really is a bit of a Euro sort of horror story. There's a very detailed set of clauses in the draft new directive setting out exactly what this benefit statement would look like. It would have to be on 2 pages. The font size is going to be specified in Euro regulations. I promise you, I'm not making this up. It would have to include synthetic graphical indicators so members could see and possibly understand the investment risks they might be exposed to, and so on and so on. And of course, our view is that many of our pension schemes have done great work to develop their communications and to innovate and tailor them so they work for their particular members. So saying this is how you've got to do it in this standardised way is not the way to go. So that's something we're battling and lobbying on. So that's the proposal we had from Commissioner Barnier last year. There are substantial costs attached to all this. And Chris, it ties in with what you've been saying about trying to bear down on costs and scrutinise them. And of course, we, as you say, we have a charge cap. But I put some figures up here. These aren't my figures. These are drawn from the European Commission's own impact assessment. And it has to be said, it was a pretty sketchy affair. And our friend Mr. Timmermans in his unit has twice rejected it. But even so, it's the best figures we've got. They've been put together by the Commission officials themselves. And they say that for for all schemes, there'd be a one-off implementation cost, €22 per member, which sounds pretty hefty to me. For DB schemes, down at the bottom, there'd be annual ongoing costs every year, recurring costs, something between 0.27 and 0.8 of a euro per year. And for DC schemes, because of a requirement for a depository, the Commission say, well, that will cost about 2 to 3 euros per member per year. So you can see, Chris, that if you start to tot all this up, I don't know how you're going to stay below your 0.75, the government's 0.75% charge cap. And these are only the Commission's figures, and we know that Commission impact assessments are usually a bit on the soft side. So those are the potential costs of this new directive. So it won't surprise you, we're lobbying hard on this. The directive is now starting to make its way through the EU's legislative scrutiny process. And because you all, as you've shown or follow it all so closely, you'll know that this is known as co-decision. Co-decision because there are two institutions involved, essentially, the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers. And of course, the Council of Ministers meets in different formations, if you like. For our purposes, it's really Treasury Ministers meeting in ECOFIN, but a lot of work is done by civil servants from national governments in working groups. So, where has this got to so far? Well, the Italians were chairing the Council of Ministers in the second half of last year. You'll know, of course, that the EU still has this system of presidency rotating from one member state to another. I don't know, Chairman, of any other organisation that would change its chair and secretariat every 6 months and think this was an efficient way of working. But, you know, this is what goes on. So, Italians actually did quite a decent job, I thought, last autumn. And they convened a whole series of meetings of a working group of experts. That means people like Alan Napier from the Department of Work and Pensions and Lee O'Rourke from the Treasury, so sort of middle to senior officials in the UK government. And they were going to these meetings with a lot of briefings in their hands from the NAPF and hammering out amendments to Monsieur Barnier's proposal with their counterparts from other governments. And I thought it did quite a good job, simplified the proposals quite a lot, resulting in what they call a common position, a sort of a new version of the legislation just before last Christmas. So that was the Council's first look at the legislation. The baton now passes across to the European Parliament, and they're making a bit of a slow start on it all. It's going to be the Economic Committee, Econ, in the Parliament that does most of the work on this, and they've appointed the man who's going to coordinate and lead their work, and it's this gentleman you can see on the picture, Brian Hayes. He's an Irish Fine Gael MEP. That means he's in the centre-right European People's Party as a European level grouping. He's the main reason Joanne and I were in Brussels yesterday, because we had an hour with him, and we've met him before. And I think he's good news. A former Irish finance minister, financially very literate, understands our issues. He's from, crucially, he's from another country which has a substantial workplace pensions sector and whose pension schemes are structured, not dissimilarly to ours. So that's all great news. And he seems a man we can do some good business with. And he certainly doesn't want to start to unpick a lot of the simplifications that the Council of Ministers have made. We've seen the other parties have appointed what they call their shadow rapporteurs to sort of represent their work. And they've set out a timetable. It's all a bit drawn out. We'll look at this thing over the summer, debate amendments in the autumn, and then at some point towards the end of this year, we'll see the Council of Ministers and the Parliament sitting down together to thrash out any disagreements in what's called the conciliation process. So all that means we might expect to see the new directive perhaps finalised sometime early next year, I'm guessing. And with a couple of years grace period then for implementation, it means this will come into force possibly 2018, roughly speaking, just to give you an idea of the potential timescale. So, I've just summarised here some of those helpful simplifications that have been made to the draft of the directive. And they are pretty good, actually. We've seen something called the delegated acts removed. Delegated acts are where there's a piece of secondary legislation from the European Commission that says how the directive has to be implemented. That's been struck out. So has the provision for EIOPA, the European Pensions Regulator, to issue guidance on that. So all this means that we'll get the directive, and then British authorities, i.e. the pensions regulator, will decide how exactly we go about putting it into practice here. And I think that's good because it means there's a much better chance of it being done in a way that works with the grain of British pension schemes. The risk evaluation report, that new report that you're going to have to compile as pension schemes, still there, but now made much simpler. So that's some progress. The pension benefit statement, article after article after article in this draft directive has now been deleted. So the idea it's got to be on 2 pages and we're going to specify the font size and all that stuff, that's all gone. So you would still have to produce this statement, but there'll be a lot more freedom to decide how it's done. And I'm going to say a bit about fit and proper rules for trustees in a moment. The bad news is that after a lot of moments where we thought we'd won and then lost and then won and then lost the battle on the issue about cross-border schemes and their funding, at the moment we're losing that one, and the rule requiring full funding is back in the text. But there's a long way to go as the Parliament scrutinises all this. Now, I know we've got a lot of trustees here, I think, yes? So you're the people on whom this new requirement to be fit and proper is going to fall. So this is the one bit where I've actually put down for you the text of the EU directive so you can see it for yourselves. So here we've got the current law, the current IORP directive that requires an IORP to be run by persons of good repute. No problem there, Chairman, looking around the room, evidently. That's all fine, good repute. And it says you have to have professional qualifications and experience, or employ advisors with the appropriate professional qualifications and experience. And so that word "or" is pretty crucial here. It means that lay trustees can satisfy this if they employ professional advisors, which a scheme would do. The bottom box shows the new proposal for the new directive, and it's quite radically different. It says, reading the keywords, that all persons who effectively run the scheme, i.e. trustees, must, in item A, they must have professional qualifications, knowledge and experience. And that word "or," allowing you to pass that requirement to professional advisors, that's all struck out. So this means that trustees will have to have professional qualifications. Now, seems to me that's just not compatible with lay trustees, and this would cause maybe a fine for pension schemes in other member states, but it would be a big, big problem in the UK. So this has been a big focus for the NEPF's lobbying so far. And the good news is that the wording, a new wording, that emerged before Christmas in that common position version from the Council of Ministers is pretty helpful. It now says that they've taken out, if you look at A, they've scratched out the word professional. So you no longer have to have professional qualifications. And also, further along the same line, the assessment of your knowledge and experience will be done collectively across the trustee board as a whole, not falling on each individual trustee. So that's much more flexible. So we hope that this wording, we think it'll work, and we hope it doesn't get changed as it goes through the parliamentary scrutiny process. So that's been the result, really, of a lot of NEPF lobbying and a lot of briefing notes that I give to civil servants and send off to MEPs. And as you'll see, we've been working with the CBI and the TUC as well. And the great advantage of this issue is pensions is one of the few issues where you can get both the CBI and the TUC all literally on the same page. And of course, that makes a great lobbying proposition. So, just to summarise what the potential new requirements are that are going to fall on trustees, and including member-nominated trustees. You're going to have to commission and review a new risk evaluation report, but it looks like it might be simpler than we feared. You'll have to put in place a remuneration policy. I would expect there'd be some guidance on that from the pensions regulator. You have to make sure you're compliant with the new rules on outsourcing and notify outsourcing to the regulator. You'll have to produce and send out these pension benefit statements, but again, it's all been made a bit simpler. Ideally, we might get to a position where the information you send out at the moment is deemed to be sufficient. I hope so. And you've got to make sure you comply with these fit and proper requirements, but it looks like we're getting there and there won't be a problem on that front. So those are the requirements from we look likely to get from the new IORP directive. I did say I'd talk about other developments. I've summarised them on one sheet. First one, the holistic balance sheet. So this is the Euro name for that idea of a solvency system for pensions. I said it was left out of the new directive last year, and that was great news. Unfortunately, AOPA, the European Insurance and Pensions Authority, sort of TPR's EU version, who are based in Frankfurt, are still keen on this, and they're beavering away. They've just had a big consultation on it. They're going to run an impact study this summer, accompanied by some stress tests on pension schemes, which a regulator may ask you to do. And they're still pushing it. But the Commission and Jonathan Hill's staff have told us pretty clearly they have no intention of taking this forwards. And we're just trying to get the Commission to say that publicly, because if that's true, that's really good news. We had an announcement a few weeks ago from the Commission saying that they've extended the exemption that pension schemes currently have from the EU rules on over-the-counter derivatives, OTC derivatives. So there's a system of central clearing has been introduced for OTC derivatives. Pension schemes are exempt from that. At least they were exempt up to August 2015. That's now being extended for 2 years to August 2017 and potentially then for a further year beyond that. But do note, central clearing is the way all this is going eventually. And finally, I should mention Jonathan Hill and the European Commission's big new shiny idea, the Capital Markets Union. If you do come to Edinburgh and hear him speak, he'll say a lot about this. The idea is to get more finance flowing around Europe, particularly more non-bank sources of finance, particularly into small and medium-sized companies, startups, get the jobs and growth I talked about flowing. And they've got some ideas in this that affect pension schemes, including a review of the rules on securitization and considering whether we can make more use of securitization. Some of this seems a bit like a package of sort of bits and bobs, but the good news is I think that the whole of this new big green paper on Capital Markets Union is a recognition that large and long-term institutional investors like pension schemes have got an important role to play in the EU economy. And that's a good starting point for the discussions we have. So, I'm sorry that Joanne isn't here to speak or to answer your questions, but I am.
Great, thanks James. Thank you.